Mordechai was, there was a connection between the return of some of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael sometime before these events of Purim, and Mordechai and his presence in the Persian court, because even before he was promoted to this very high position and he replaced Haman, even before this, we see that Mordechai was present. He was around. He was in the palace courtyard. He was involved. He wasn't a stranger to the Persian court and to the machinations and workings of the empire. So what was Mordechai doing there? What was his job? Why was he there in the first place? I think another largely overlooked and misunderstood aspect of Purim is the fact that the return of Am Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael, the return of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland at that time, or a couple of generations before, 3 generations before that time, was a very hot topic in the Persian Empire. We know this for a fact from Sefer Ezra and Nehemiah, where we see that, as I mentioned before, the Goyim roundabout were very upset and displeased, to put it mildly, with the return of these pesky Jews who were getting in the way and wanted to rebuild the wall of the Homa, the wall around Yerushalayim, and they were rebuilding the Mikdash, which is of course what they had been allowed to do. But eventually Koresh died, another king came along, and another decree was issued preventing them from continuing this work. There was a lot of political machination and intrigue connected with the return of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael, just as things are today. Exactly the same reality as it was 100 years ago, and as it was 30 years ago, and as it is today, and as it will be in a year or 30 years from now as well. Because the Jewish people always have enemies, particularly when it comes to the Jewish people returning to where they belong, which is not necessarily what certain other groups and peoples and nations really have in mind. It's not in their interests, shall we say. And the Persian Empire, which was the reigning power, within that Persian Empire, within the court, there were different factions. Haman, in my view, was the head of that faction, which wanted to prevent the Jews really putting down roots and re-establishing themselves in Eretz Yisrael. He's referred to as Haman ha'al-Ghari, a descendant of the Amalekim. But all of the enemies of the Jewish people formed a faction. You don't have to be an Amaleki necessarily in the biological sense to not want the Jews to return to their villages and towns in Eretz Yisrael and to re-establish themselves. As we read again in the Tanakh, in Ezra and Nehemiah, there were the Shomronim and the Kuthim and various nations and groups and tribes that had invaded and overtaken parts of the country, and they had their representatives in their Shtadlanim. They had their they had their lobbyists in the Persian court, just as today there's a Jewish lobby in the United States, in the American political machine, and there are pro-Arab, pro-Iranian, pro all kinds of lobbyists and lobbies and interests, and there's lots of money involved and lots of intrigue and goings on backwards and forwards. Exactly the same thing was happening in those times. Mordechai was the representative, was the lobbyist for the Jews, and Haman was the lobbyist for the enemies of the Jews, and that is why they couldn't stand each other. And Haman also, on top of all of this, decided that if possible, he would also put an end to this entire debate, as it were, with these Jews who are a tremendous nuisance and causing trouble and working against his interests and the interests of his people and his allies by simply wiping them out. And that essentially is the story of Purim. So I hope that with this information, Purim before you, this year Purim will perhaps take on a different aspect from what it was perhaps in the minds of many people, until having perhaps heard this shiur, these sources, and having understood them as we have explained them today. Kol tuv lachem. I wish you all the best. Purim Sameach, and Hizku v'yames levavchem kol ha'mei halim l'Adonai.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom, shalom.
A Shushan Purim Sameach to you.
Kol tov. Shalom. Although I no longer live in Yerushalayim, so I do not celebrate.
Oh, you'll be celebrating the same day as us.
Same day as you, correct. Kol tov.
Kol tov.
I cannot end the session, but someone else has to.
Okay, I think Achihud is trying to arrange if there are any questions.
Yeah, do you want to take questions, Rabbi?
I'll take a couple of questions if there are.
Okay, Daniel has one.
Shalom, Rav. I sent this question in the chat, but I can just ask it on here. My question was, to which extent the story of Purim should be taken literally and historically, as opposed to, for example, something that occurred in the spiritual realm or may be interpreted as allegory?
First of all, explain why you or someone else might imagine that such a Megillah written in such detail, why would someone imagine that this is an allegory rather than referring to real events?
We had a class given, and there was an example given of this. I know what he's talking about.
Go on. Go on.
Well, for example, Adam and Chava in Sefer Bereshit, some say that they interacted literally with a nachash, and some say that their interaction didn't occur physically in the material realm, but in the spiritual one. And their story is also written in great detail, both in the Torah Shebichtav, and it is also referenced in the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So inferring from that, I'm not really sure what to make of Megillat Esther as a text.
I personally do not see any possible room for comparison between what we find in Sefer Bereshit with regards to Adam and Hawa, which is written in an ahistorical context. It's not doesn't relate to any historical events to which we can refer, with which we are familiar. And yes, there is definitely room, as some of our great rabbis and sages have pointed out, there is room to understand that perhaps in an allegorical sense, and there is reason to do so. I would also point out that it's not nearly the same amount of detail. You're talking there about something that's related in a few tens, perhaps, of Pesukim at the most, whereas in the Megillat Esther, you're talking about 9 chapters. You're talking about hundreds of Pesukim. Megillat Esther describes, in my view, very real historical events. I know that there are people of different stripes and different types who have suggested otherwise. I'm familiar with this claim, but I do not see any basis or reason to entertain such thoughts. We know there was a Persian Empire. We know that the Jews were permitted by Koresh, approximately, assuming that we know when Ahasuerus reigned, and I think we do, roughly the mid 5th century Leminyana, according to their Goyish calculations. So approximately 3 generations before that time, Koresh permitted the Jews to return to Yerushalayim, to Eretz Yisrael, to rebuild the Mikdash. This is related, these events are also related to the Tanakh, that it actually took place. The Jews, some Jews, not maybe as many as should have, but some Jews returned in the original return, and later with Ezra, and later with Nehemiah. That was the beginning of that was the seed that eventually blossomed into the period of the Beit Sheni, the Second Temple period, when the Jews became very numerous indeed in Eretz Yisrael. Initially, there were only a few tens of thousands of Jews, as recorded in Sefer Ezra. We know all this is very real. We know when Ahasuerus lived, give or take. There is discussion about that as well, but I think it's fairly clear when he lived. There was such a king. We know which king this was. We know that there were there was great rivalry and dislike and downright hatred and even attempts to physically attack the Jews who were rebuilding the walls of Yerushalayim, as described in Sefer Nehemiah. We know all of this to be true. Nehemiah is roughly around the same time as Mordechai. And I think if you just read the Megillah with your eyes wide open, and you with all these facts that we've mentioned in the background, I think it becomes very obvious that Mordechai was a lobbyist for the Jewish cause, and Haman was part of the anti-Jewish faction, and he rose to a very high position, and he immediately tried to misuse his power to destroy the Jews and destroy their political aspirations as well, because he was an Aravi. He was a descendant of ancient enemies of the Jewish people. And if you wish to claim that he wasn't actually a descendant of these ancient enemies, these Amalekim of the Jewish people, well, then that only forces one to draw an additional and even more far-reaching conclusion. And this is a statement that Rabbeinu Hagaon, Rabbi Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik Zetzal writes in the book Ish HaEmunah, the man of faith, the name of his father, Hagaon Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik, that Amalek is not a biological reality. It does not refer to a particular racial group, but rather any staunch, bitter, and determined enemy of the Jewish people who make it their business to destroy the Jews, who make it plain, who state in their own words that we wish to kill the Jews and destroy them and not allow them to have their country, their sovereign country in their homeland. We wish to drive them into the sea, etc., etc. Any such people are to be seen as having the halachic definition. This is not a drasha that Rav Soloveitchik was stating. Rav Soloveitchik was not a person who made drashas. He didn't give over voting. Rav Soloveitchik was an Ish Halacha, another one of his books by that very name, Ish Halacha, Ish Emunah. He thought in halachic terms. He was an Ish Halacha. He was a Gaon Atzum, and a very profound Gaon, and he saw and explained this concept of Amalek as referring to any group of Oivim Muvhakim of the Jewish people in all generations. And he explicitly says that at that time, when he gave this speech in which he said that he gave this shiur, when he mentioned these ideas. This was in 1956, the time of the Suez Crisis. And he says in earlier years, in the 30s and the 40s, it was the Nazis and the Germans and their associates And today he said it's Nasser and the Mufti and their associates. وَإِدَاخ zil gemor, hamevin yavin. There is no need to belabor the point. The halachic truth of this statement, I think, is overwhelming when it is understood and perceived correctly, with an open mind and an open heart.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.